this is Thorin from On Gamers, and this is an overview video for a piece I've written which examines the top 5 teams in LCS North America, but relative only to each other in terms of the games they've played directly head to head. And so I'll kind of give an overview of why I wrote the piece, a few interesting conclusions, things that I think are worth looking at, and then if you want to read more of it, read the piece. If not, you can just take this as kind of like a companion. So let's start out with the reason why it's worth doing this. Okay, well, I'd immediately say, whenever you look at the league that isn't finished yet, you're going to immediately get into a situation where if teams are tied, then you're already going to have to start looking at the record of who they've played. Because since the league isn't finished, odds are, depending on what time of the season it is, obviously, one team might have played the worst team more times than another team who's tied with them has played the worst team. So there we go. That's already a chance where even though the records might be tied, actually they might have had an easier schedule. Meanwhile, maybe they then have a harder schedule coming up of the best teams to play, and so their record will actually go down, and the team that's tied with them who hasn't played the worst teams, maybe they have an easier schedule coming up. So the standings, oh yeah, sure, they are equal right now, but it might be misleading because one might have gotten more out of the easier part while the other one might have their easy part coming up now, which could obviously put one up and one down. You can see the obvious trend that you'd go with. Well, that's the way you'd already start to break down a scenario of just any tie in the league anyway. So even more so, if you get into a strange scenario like we have right now in LCS NA. In LCS NA right now, the top 4 teams are all tied for first place. They all have an 11-7 record. And what's more, okay, so we've got 4 teams already we have to look at and decide between them and battle amongst each other. But then the 5th team are the 2-time reigning split champions, Cloud9. And even though they're in 5th place, because those other 4 are all tied for first, they're only 1 win out of first place. So really, you look at these teams, and it doesn't even make sense just to look at the foursome. It's worth making it a 5-some, make it into a quintet, and take these 5 teams. And so what I thought was, like I described in the scenario before, the general scenario of a tie, let's do the same thing. Let's look, have any of these teams who are tied, so they all, against the whole field, have the same record. Have some played certain teams that were good more often? Have some played certain teams that are bad more often? Well, immediately I can tell you the 2 ends of the spectrum there, which is Cloud9 have played more of the top 5 teams than anyone else. They've played 11 games against the top 5 teams, while everyone else is at 10, and then Cloud9 and TSM has played the least. They're at only 9 games against the top 5. Meanwhile, now let's go to the bottom end of the spectrum. Against the bottom 3 teams in the league, so everyone else except this group we're examining now, so Curse, EG, Call. Against the bottom 3 teams, TSM has played them the most times. Meanwhile, they've played them 9 times, 3 each. Meanwhile, every other team in this top 5 has played only 8 times against those bottom 3. So now we get to a scenario where, okay, even though TSM's tied for first place there, well, they've actually played the worst teams 1 extra time, and they're one win ahead of Cloud9, remember? Meanwhile, we take Cloud9, they're 1 win behind TSM, for example, and all the other teams, but they've actually played the best teams in the league more than everyone else. They've played 2 games more against the top 5 than TSM, and 1 game more than the others. So immediately, you're starting to see how easier and potentially more difficult schedules could have played a role in how these rankings are done so far, and how these might not necessarily be just straight, even though the numbers are a tie, they could be misleading. Okay, so let's go a bit deeper. Now you start to ask yourself, okay, which teams are the best in this respect? Well, actually, believe it or not, the team with by far the best record against the top 5 is the worst of the 5. They're the only one that aren't tied to first place. It's Cloud9. Cloud9 have played more games against the top 5, and they've also won more games against the top 5, and not only that, they don't have a losing record against anyone. That's incredible, and it's on itself there. Obviously, I won't go through all of the 5 teams here, because that's what the article's about, and it makes a lot more sense to read it, actually, the way I formatted it than just to watch the video entirely. But I'll give you some other factors, because I'm kind of like presenting this in a different way than I do in the article. So then you go the other way, and you think about TSM. Okay, so TSM has played the worst teams the most times, and they've played the top teams the least times. So on one hand, it makes sense, okay, that they could be tied for first place without being the best because they've got an extra win essentially against the worst teams. And not only that, you look at their record and you actually find that when they play those 3 worst teams, they've never lost. So listen, they're doing a great job of keeping down the worst teams. That's where their problem comes in, though, because what should obviously follow from anyone hearing that, oh, they've never lost to the worst teams. Well, if they've lost 7 games overall, that means those 7 games must have all come against the top 5 teams. Exactly, that's the problem. TSM is tied for first place, but they've actually played the top 5 teams less than anyone else, 1 game less than Dignitas, LMQ, CLG, and yet they've lost more times against those top 5 teams than any of the 4 teams above them. And so technically, by the time they get to an equal amount of games against those, they could have lost another one as well. They could be up to 8 losses against those top 4 teams, top 5 including themselves, but you know what I mean, top 4. Meanwhile, obviously those other teams have won more games against them. If you want to break it down a bit further, you basically get Dignitas joins TSM in this like best category, but they haven't got quite as high a win rate, but they've got an impressive set of wins and losses. Then the middle of the pack really is the LMQ and CLG guys, and what's interesting there is they both have different factors going for them actually. Like CLG have taken wins off everyone. Let me think, have they? I'll just double check that. Yes, CLG have beaten everyone, so that's an upside, obviously, to have beaten everyone. Meanwhile, LMQ have more winning records against other top teams, even though they haven't ever beaten Dignitas. So you see there's like pluses and minuses to both of those middling teams. So anyway, in general, you can see kind of, it's not like a super statistical breakdown level. All I've done is taken this particular filter of like, let's see how these teams did against the other top 5 teams, and I've gone team by team and I've ranked them into these 3 different tiers of like the best, the middle pack, and then the worst. And I've looked at the reasons as to, essentially I've looked at like what conclusions could you maybe draw, because obviously the season hasn't ended yet, so there's more can change, but what can we draw so far? Like what types of teams are they losing against, what times are they winning against, what could that spell out for the playoffs? And I think that's a key point to make, is that the reason why this is interesting to do now is because, yeah, these teams are deadlocked, so it's nice to have a sense anyway of who could be stronger actually in a relative sense out of these teams. But that's literally what the playoffs will end up being, won't it? Because it'll be the top 6 teams. So it'll be, in theory, well, assuming nothing crazy happens, these 5 teams plus another one. Maybe it's Curse, who knows, maybe Cold goes crazy. It seems unlikely. So it'll probably be Curse and these 5. Well, in this scenario now it's going to really matter if you're TSM and you haven't really won many games against those top teams, because they're the only ones you're facing to try and get the world spot. Meanwhile, if you're Cloud9, conversely, okay, right now you're not tied for first place. Maybe you don't even finish first place at the end of the split. But if you've still got winning records against all these teams and you've won more games, well, now you can be confident, like, we might win any series, we can beat anyone, we can win the whole league. You know, forget the regular season, that won't even matter. So, something to think about. It's more of a food for thought article. Like, I want to see what other people take from this and if these conclusions hold up and which ones actually don't. And if any of these end up being a good indicator for the playoffs. It's just something to think about as the season goes on. So have a look in the description box if you want to read the full article. Otherwise, I'll give you kind of an overview here. So see you later.